Adding CSS to HTML is nice, but there are so many things you want to do and so many rules to set up. That takes time. If you've ever run into a problem that requires a lot of code, often repeatedly, chances are someone has already created something to solve that problem for you. Welcome to Libraries and Frameworks. In this video, we'll be talking about Bootstrap, which is a popular framework designed to speed up the process of creating web pages with many of the standard features you've already come to expect. Libraries are simply code you can import and use. Frameworks are also libraries, but tend to have stronger opinions about how code should be implemented and how the parts flow. Frameworks constrain the choices we can make to get things to work, but offer us greater convenience since how the parts work together are already determined for us. Bootstrap is a framework that offers us expected HTML structural blueprints and pre-made CSS rules to create components. Components are simply multiple elements put together to create different interfaces. Bootstrap also offers us JavaScript code we can implement without typing any JavaScript at all. We'll be exploring how to set up Bootstrap with your web projects, and we'll discuss some of the fundamental concepts to get up and running. Like most topics, we won't be covering every detail of the Bootstrap framework, but by keeping in mind some of the important patterns of how such frameworks work, you'll learn how to approach the Bootstrap documentation and implement the features that interest you. So, let's dive right in and start using Bootstrap. So when we talk about Bootstrap being a framework, what do we really mean? What's the problem that we're trying to solve? So when it comes to the web, multiple kinds of devices, whether it's a digital phone or a tablet or a desktop, have different kinds of screen constraints and abilities. For example, right now we're taking a look at the Bootstrap website on my giant 43-inch 4K monitor. Obviously, there's a lot of screen space that we can be using to look at the site. And so, it's going to behave in a certain way and visually display itself with those kinds of, ideas in mind. But what happens if we look at this same web page on a small, tiny, compact iPhone? Essentially, we can't fit all this information on that tiny screen unless the text is 2 pixels big, and that's not very user-friendly or readable. So, we need a way to adapt our web pages so that they can be seen on multiple devices. And this is a concept that we call responsive. Depending on the constraints of your device and screen size, we can kind of respond by appropriately displaying CSS rules to lay out our pages in appropriate ways. To give you a sense of how this works, what we can do is we can go in and go into our inspector. So I'm going to do that. And now you can see that I have, for example, the code on the right side, and I can take a look at things. And this is essentially the whole Bootstrap site. And, there are obviously a lot of different kinds of structural elements that make this entire code. But the thing we're going to focus on right now is let's take a look at how this changes as we change the device. In the upper left-hand corner of the DevTools, there is a little device toolbar button here. And when I click on that, what that does is it allows me to emulate what this site would look like on different devices. So for example, right now you can see that I have set this to emulate iPhone X, or is it iPhone 10? I'm not really sure. But you can already see how there is a difference between how the site is presented on a mobile phone compared to how it would be presented on a giant monitor or even a laptop. So again, by clicking on this little device tool, we can go in and we can kind of test it out. For example, over here, I can rotate the phone to see what it would look like on a horizontal plane. And you can already see, for example, even based on the orientation of your device, right, the menu layout looks a little bit different. The content gets squeezed in a little bit different ways. If we kind of go down here, for example, under installation, we see content on the left and right. But if we flip it to this narrow mode, right, all of a sudden, these things are actually top to bottom, content here and the demonstration below it. So this is what's happening behind the hood. we have a responsive framework that is guiding how the site behaves. And that's just importing a bunch of CSS and some structural blueprints for our HTML. And as long as we follow that framework's opinion of how to build web pages, it will automatically be able to do things like this. And so this is very useful since these days, a lot of people are consuming web content through their mobile devices, and we can never really predict exactly what kind of device they will be reading this content on. So that's the idea of responsiveness. And there are actually many different kinds of responsive frameworks that you can use. Bootstrap is only one of the choices. For example, one of the examples that we can be looking at is something called Materialize. I actually don't know if this is a popular framework, but it's there to solve the same kinds of problems that Bootstrap has. How do we kind of create these web pages really quickly using different kinds of components that can react and be responsive to the needs of the user? And so when we take a look at this, you'll notice that, for example, there's a different color scheme, but this is the documentation for it. And again, if we go into Inspector, usually these sites are using these responsive frameworks. You'll notice that again on my iPhone, or for example, if I go to an iPad Pro, right, it totally changes how this page is laid out. We have a menu bar on the left on the iPad Pro and the content on the right. But again, if we go to an iPhone, in the vertical orientation, all of that disappears and the menu is actually tucked away as a component, like a menu component that slides in from the left. So again, it's like this would take a lot of work for us to do if we had to code everything from scratch, but these kinds of responsive frameworks offer you that code already and easy ways to put up components that allow us to just focus on the nature of the experience rather than the code. And I keep mentioning components, but this is a great place to introduce this. It's same with Bootstrap. Components are basically just HTML structured in a blueprinty way. So they want you to build these interfaces in a certain way to get certain kinds of commonly understood conventions for how interfaces are presented. For example, over here, right, we're taking a look at a component called badges, right? And badges are these things like, you have 4 new emails. And so, this is pretty simple with CSS. It probably wouldn't take us a lot of work to do this kind of thing. But if we want to use badges in this, we would basically take a look at the example HTML structure here, and then we would use the classes that they provide for us that's documented to make this happen. And so all we have to do is basically apply a class, and then the rules are applied and it looks the way that we behave, or it behaves the way we want it to look. I guess that's the correct way to say that. And there are other options too. Materialize, Bootstrap are very, I guess, larger frameworks that offer you a lot of different kinds of components, but there are very minimal ones too. For example, here's one called Skeleton. And Skeleton, if I scroll all the way to the top, is a simple responsive framework that really only offers something called a grid system. And this is something we'll be talking about with Bootstrap as well. How do we get all these different layout parts of our page to behave in a certain way? Well, one of the ways that we're going to do it is by using what they provide called a grid system. What you might notice is that many of these pages are divided into what we call a grid. You can think about the layout as a bunch of rows, and inside each row, multiple columns. And we can kind of split the page using this idea of a page is divided into rows from top to bottom, and each row can have columns left to right. And we can split those sub-columns into further rows that go top to bottom within that column, and then within that row, further column divisions from left to right. And you can, of course, change the direction in which these things are laid out, but most web pages are boxes inside of boxes. And this is something that we've kind of explored and talked about in the past. Grid systems allow us to do nice things with these boxes. So for example, over here, you can see that we can simply lay out a system where the page is split into 2 parts, a left and a right. And we can change how wide these parts are. For example, here is an example of a grid system where basically a grid system is divided into 12 parts in this framework. And we have a column on the left that is only one column unit wide, and the rest is 11. And, if we kind of go down the line, a column that is left and right could be 6 and 6 to make 12. So, this is the concept that we do to divide our page into these nice, evenly, predictably behavioral layouts. And so, again, this responsiveness, the root of it is the grid system, and this is something that we'll be talking about a lot as we explore the features of Bootstrap. But first, what we're going to need to do is set up Bootstrap in our system before we can play with it. So let's give that a try right now. So when we want to use a framework like Bootstrap, we're going to have to set it up. And what that consists of is importing the code that they are providing for us so that we can implement it into our works. Oftentimes with these frameworks, depending on the ones you choose, have documentation. So here we're on the getbootstrap.com website. This is the official documentation for Bootstrap version 4.5. These things constantly get updated, so you're going to want to always make sure that if you're looking at documentation, you're looking at the correct version of the framework you're using. Otherwise, some funny things will happen. But they often have a very simple get started, which I'm just going to click right here. And you'll see here, basically, it has a quick start guide where it's saying, hey, copy paste this CSS and copy paste this JavaScript. So what this means is, again, we are borrowing code from other people. Bootstrap is actually developed by the folks, I think, at Twitter. And so when we import these code into our projects, then it's at that point that we can use them. So for example, here I am going to be importing their CSS style sheet, which is going to have a lot of different rules already made for us with the selectors and the property values. And so all we need to really understand is, what are the selectors? For example, what kind of classes are they using, and apply them, then the rules will automatically be applied. However, if you forget to import the CSS and you try to use the Bootstrap way of getting things up and running, your app is going to be like, hey, I don't know what these rules are. No one ever told me anything. So this is why importing is really important. And so this one has CSS that's going to be imported, which we'll demonstrate, and JavaScript as well. One thing I want to mention here is that with JavaScript, you'll notice that we actually have to import 3 different scripts into our application in order for this to work. So with JavaScript, Twitter has, or Bootstrap has JavaScript that it needs, but in order for it to work, it needs other JavaScript libraries that it's borrowing. And so what's happening now is something called dependencies. One JavaScript file is dependent on another might be dependent on further another. And so there's a very complex relationship. You got to make sure that all the parts are imported and in the correct order. So for example, Bootstrap uses something called jQuery. And without jQuery, a lot of the Bootstrap code internally can't function. So we need to import jQuery first. Then on top of that, something called Popper, which to be honest, I don't even know what that does, but apparently it's needed. And then Bootstrap last. If, for example, you import Bootstrap first before the jQuery, right? You load the Bootstrap and the Bootstrap, okay, I got to start running, but hey, I don't know how to run this jQuery stuff because I haven't loaded it yet. That's a problem. So again, be kind of aware of the sequence and order of dependencies when you're reading these things. But essentially what we're going to be doing is creating a starter template like this. And if you look at this template, let me make this a little bit bigger, right? You can see that this is a basic template of HTML. We have the doc type, and then we have HTML tag, head, and they are importing Bootstrap on this line here. It actually goes way beyond, and you can just copy paste these kinds of things. And then you can see how they have the body, and at the very end of the body, right, they are importing all of their JavaScript stuff in the sequenced dependency order that it requires. And so our typical Bootstrap pages that we create are going to look something similar to this, but using CodePen, there's actually an easier way to get these things imported. So let's take a look at CodePen and do that right now. So here we are in CodePen. Like I said, a lot of this is going to be about copy pasting things into your code. Nobody remembers all the URLs for, where to get the Bootstrap stuff. So for example, I'm going to come back over to the documentation and let's just demonstrate this by copy pasting this stuff over into our CodePen HTML. So I do that. And I think CodePen's going to give me a little bit of a warning like this, right? That says, hey, it's like just the HTML that goes in the body goes here. Remember, CodePen is a convenience for us. So we can actually just copy the body stuff in directly into this square and it does its magic. But it still actually processes and works. So you can see, for example, that it is actually saying hello world. And I can start to use Bootstrap type things like this. For example, if I did something like span and then 4 new messages, right? Normally, this would just be regular text, something like this. However, in Bootstrap, if I wanted to create something called a badge, which I talked about a little bit earlier, I would use the class that they provide for me in their CSS that I imported, and the selector or the class name that I'm going to apply here that Bootstrap provides is actually just called badge. And by doing that, you can see that on the left or right hand side already it's having some stylistic changes. The text is now bold. And this actually needs, in order to create a badge, we actually need to have 2 classes. First the badge, and then badge, for example, what type, so success. And when you do this, now if I take a look at the right-hand side, you'll notice that it provides that nice badge / label type background. And again, I can change this to something like badge - alert, and it goes into the Bootstrap CSS and finds the correct one. And oh, no, not badge - alert. I made a mistake. I think it's called badge - danger or something like that. And it should turn red. And yes, it does. It turns red. And so again, we have not defined any CSS here at all. All we're doing is basically using the classes that Bootstrap provided us, and then it's looking up from the imported style sheet how it should look, and that's kind of the convenience. You're not going to memorize all of these different class names for different kinds of components, but the more you use Bootstrap and frameworks like these, you'll start to get used to the class names that you use the most, and it'll come with more automaticity as you get fluent. So this is kind of where we're going. And again, let's actually take a look at this. What happens if I actually remove the Bootstrap CSS altogether? I'm going to comment out this line like this. And so now our page is not loading the imported CSS. And you can notice there's a lot of different changes. For example, now the font is Times New Roman. Of course, none of the colors are there, etc. Maybe even the font size has changed a little bit. I'm not quite sure if it did. Let's actually check again. So here I'm turning it back on. Yeah, so the heading font size is a little bit bigger in Bootstrap, but without it, it's a little bit smaller. So, it affects every aspect of our page. And just by importing it here, we can get it to work. However, right now, it's like we ran into the thing where basically it's like, hey, you don't need to actually have a doc type or HTML tag or head tag when you're doing CodePen. All you really need is the body. Well, what happens if I just copy paste the body portion of this, right? And, do that. What's the problem, right? Let's see what this looks like, and nothing is happening, right? So why is that? Let me just format this really quickly. Why is this not behaving the way we want? Well, of course, we just copied the code from the body, which didn't have the link to the CSS. So right now in this state, our application is not importing any CSS, and that's why we're getting the default boring values. So let's go back and just copy paste just this line, right? This line here is from this, so I'm just going to copy paste this entire thing. And if I include this at the top here, now the first thing it does is it references the style sheet, imports it in, and now again our site is Bootstrap ready once again. So this is one way you can do things. However, with CodePen, there's an even easier way that you can import things. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to delete all of these JavaScript things. So again, we're back to our default page. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into my CSS pane. And here, I'm going to click on this little gear box on the left-hand side. When you click on this, it opens up a menu that makes it super easy to import different kinds of external style sheets and JavaScript. What I can do is go in here, and I'm under CSS, and come down, And I can actually search for resources like Bootstrap. So I'm going to say Bootstrap, and it's listed under Twitter Bootstrap, right? So I just click on this, and you'll notice that it kind of has the URL here. And this URL is from something called a CDN, which is a content distribution network. What's cool is that they have these servers all over the world that are hosting this CSS style sheet to you. So all you got to do is just have that CDN URL and you can grab it from anywhere. And there's other benefits too. For example, when you use a CDN, many sites use the same URL for their Bootstrap on their site. So if a person has already gone to a different website but loaded Bootstrap from that URL from that CDN, when they come to your site, it'll be like, hey, I actually know this URL from the CDN already. Let me go check. Yeah, I have Bootstrap in my browser saved, cached already. And so it actually doesn't have to download anything. It just checks and your browser has it and it just runs. So this is the advantage of using CDNs. Once you import that, I would save and close. And now, right, even though I don't have any CSS here and there's no links here, it is importing Bootstrap and I'm starting to get the stylistic changes and I've verified that. Again, you can do the same thing with JavaScript as well. So for example, in the JavaScript, if I want to import the Bootstrap stuff, I'll come back over here and say Bootstrap, and I can click on this and you'll notice over here, oops, I shouldn't have closed that. Open this up again. You'll notice over here, it's 4.5.2 JavaScript, and then down here, bootstrap.min.js. And so this is the JavaScript file. However, you might also be thinking, Jin, but you were talking about dependencies. What about those other things? So yeah, those other things that were needed are also important. For example, we go back to the documentation and look at it. It says we also need jQuery, and we also need something called Hopper. So again, I can go into here and import jQuery. And here's version 3.5.1. Click on that. And also something called Hopper. Still don't know what Popper does, but it says it needs it, so I'm going to have it in. And now I have these things ready to import. The only issue is you want to be very careful in order, the order and sequence in which these are loaded. And like we said, Bootstrap depends on having JavaScript first. So right now, this is going to try to load Bootstrap the JavaScript portions first, and it's not going to like it. So I want to move the jQuery to the top, and then the popper after the jQuery. This is just a place for me to add new stuff. And now that this is jQuery, popper, Bootstrap, I can do save and close. And so now you can do some cool stuff that has JavaScript implementation going for it, which we'll talking about right now. There's no real dynamic interaction with the site. So the JavaScript portion, even though we're loading it, we're not really using it. But I like to load both in the very beginning so I don't forget later. This can prevent you from being like, how come something isn't working? And the solution ends up being, oh, you forgot to import it. So this is how you can get set up with Bootstrap. Let's go into Bootstrap some more and start talking about how we can actually use it. So one of the first things you probably want to do when you're making a web page is lay out the content of your web page in a certain way. You might have a very simple page that goes from top to bottom, and for that, you really wouldn't need to have anything different. However, you might want to do some more complex things, like have 2 columns, one for some demo code and one for some pep talk. Or you might want to have 3 columns, one for the gallery images, one for some stories, one for, connect with your friends, or whatever you imagine. So again, we've kind of talked a little bit about things like Flexbox to help you lay things out. Bootstrap already has Flexbox built into it and uses it. So all we need to do is understand something called the grid system. So like I kind of started to introduce, when we talk about the grid system, what we're going to do is come out here to the Bootstrap documentation and look at something called layout. And this kind of gives an explanation of what the grid system is. But to give you a very short and brief description, essentially it's kind of like what we've been doing with, the work that we've been working on so far. We think of boxes. So there are container boxes that are split up into sub boxes. Each sub box can be split up into further container sub boxes, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, we're going to be thinking about these things in terms of large containers for the page or sections. And then, for example, things like columns in the grid, columns and rows. So for example, when we take a look at this, you'll notice that this has some demo code that's like, here's a container. Inside the container, we're going to have one row. So this is the container, and this whole thing here is the row. And then inside the row, we're going to have 3 columns, column, column, column. And to make this setup, we don't have to do any more flex layout or stuff like that, but we just set up this thing with classes. So you can see that there's a parent div here called container with the class. And then we have a sub kind of div inside the container, just one, which is the entire row, right? And we're just going to say row. And then we have 3 children inside the row, each one having the class column-sm, which means column small. And this is what produces this sort of thing. So let's give an example of this. Come back over here, and using that convention, I'm going to do something like container. And let me actually make this a little bit bigger, right? So we can see the code. Inside of the container, a row, and inside of the row, 1 column. And in my example, you'll notice I omit the -sm. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And I'm going to put my content inside of my column. And when I do that, you'll notice that something actually happened. The spacing between the left-hand side and this first content part is a little bit more padded. Without these things, right, let me just kind of move these things outside, or I can just actually copy paste that below. We can see a comparison. You'll notice that it's actually aligned perfectly 0 pixels from the left. And a lot of times things like padding, margins are helpful to make our content look nicer. The grid system, if you use this pattern of having a container, inside of containers you have rows, inside of rows you have columns, inside of columns you have your actual content, it will do these like nice little stylistic adjustments for margins and paddings automatically for you. So this is pretty cool. I don't like the second one outside of the grid system. And this is an example of a grid system using only 1 column. So this is not super interesting because if I have a paragraph, lorem 100, it just kind of behaves like our regular web page. Makes sense, right? This row is consisting of 1 giant column from left to right with some margin and padding. But it gets a lot more interesting if we want to add a second column to this. Using the system of a grid, we would imagine we have our container, then we have our row, then we have our column, but inside this row, we're going to add a second column and content here. So when we take a look at this, right, we can now see that the grid system has divided this page into 2 even columns, one on the left and one on the right. And furthermore, if I did another column, right, and said more content here, now it's going to divide this layout into a single row, which is a very tall row, but with 3 even columns, 1, 2, 3. And so if I kind of come in here and do something like image, for whatever reason, my tab isn't working. Image, let's do source equals HTTP, place hold it slash, I don't know, 100x100 or something like that. And so now my image is kind of inside this, and I got more content here. And, it's nicely even. And so, all we got to do really is look at the structure. And when we look at the Bootstrap structure for grids, you can see that, again, the parent, right, is the container. Inside of the container, we have a row, and inside of the row, however many columns that we need. And so we can go up to, I think, something like, I think it's like something like 12 columns or something. And so this is now looking a little bit wonky, right? Because essentially, there are many, many columns here and not enough space on the right-hand side to fit it all. And so if we kind of really scroll down, right, like, I guess not scrolling down, but it's really jam-packing everything in there. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I think we can actually have one more of these to make 12. And perhaps this is not the best example, but format, bear with me here. All right, so I did that. Let's minimize the unfold all. I just open this up a little bit, open up my row. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And over here, if we look at each one, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 things. And it's all jam-packed, so it's not very friendly. But again, the kind of weird magic of this is, the more that I think, make this wider, or if I go into change view and go to debug mode, and for example, go into inspect, and I take a look at what this looks like on a desktop, and maybe I'm going to zoom out a little bit, not on this side, but on this side. It actually doesn't help me see it at all. It's just a bad choice of content. Let me just do this. I'm going to create another demonstration and just do something like, let's create a column, right? And let's create 6 of them, right? And, inside that, I think what we can do is, there's like an Emmet shortcut to create demonstration content. But whatever, right? Let's just go 12. And then I'm just going to do something with multi-cursors to select through here. And I'm going to say like content, right? And if I save that and take a look, again, you can see how even that's really hard to see. If I just do C, and there's now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's 12 columns for content, and as the content gets bigger, it's just going to go down that column. So you can kind of see that. And so, when we think about grid, it's really about splitting up the row into these column divs. But we can do some things like, for example, the adjustment of these sizes in really easy ways. For example, you might start with 2 columns, right? Here, column. But you might not want them to be equally sized. Sometimes it makes sense like, well, the left-hand side should be only 1/3 of the width and the right-hand side should be 2/3. Well, the way we think about it is if it's a 12-column system, then we want to figure out what 1/3 and 2/3 are. So in 12 columns, 1/3 would be basically 4 columns wide, 2/3 would be 8 columns wide. 4 plus 8 equals 12. And so this is where we can start to do things like this. If I come in and I say column dash 4 units, and the second one is dash 8, together they would make 12. And now you can see how it's spaced a little bit differently. This column here is a lot smaller than this column here. And to kind of make this a little bit more obvious, I'm just going to say lorem, and down here, add some more lorem tab. And you'll see how, again, the way that it's fitting this now is distributed in a different way. And so again, if you wanted to do something like, for example, here, let's go something like, let's just do opposite 8 and 4. Now it's going to change, again, the widths of the columns, and we get this opposite look. We can do things like this, and we can do further things as well. So for example, with this column 8, if I wanted to have this split into further columns, what I can do is add a row inside here. And this is called nesting the grid, right? Nesting a row inside a column. And so inside here, I could then again split this into something like column, right? Dot column times 2, and then say A, and here I'm going to say B. And again, we can see how this whole column, right? Again, this is such bad examples. I'm just going to say lorem tab, whoops, unexpected character. I'm getting some kind of an error here, and I'm not quite sure what that error is. Unexpected character. Lorem. Oh, I am running into a little bit of a bug, and I cannot detect why that bug exists. So it looks pretty good to me. I'm kind of confused, but we'll just go ahead with this and see what we can do. The cat went to the river and caught a fish. I just want to kind of show the content flowing. And this, again, is a horrible example because what I just ended up doing was this left column, this whole thing is 8, which is 2/3. This one is 1/3. But of course, if you take 2/3 of the giant one and split it in half by having 2 columns in the row, then this is essentially the same as saying, column, column, column of 3 equal sizes. So again, this was a very, very dumb example. Let me remedy this by showing you something like, let's make the first sub column something like 3, which is 1/4, and then the second one something like 9, right? And so now you can see that this whole column is divided into a row which of different sized columns inside 3 and 9. And so you can kind of play around with this to get the layout that you want. And so the way that you think about this stuff is, again, and let's simplify this a little bit. I'm going to remove these. Again, come back and say, I just want a column, right, times 2. And inside here, lorem. And then over in the second one, again, lorem. And, we kind of lay this out in terms of container, row, column. And of course, if we want other things below this, we can add another row. And inside here, I might say something like column times 3. And then here, I might just do something like, this is my test content. And again, you can see how you can mix and match different rows with different types of column layout things, distributions. So this is how you can start to build out a basic web page, as complex or simple as you need. The important thing I want you to understand and always follow, however, is this idea that Bootstrap has a convention and has a way that it wants you to do things. So for example, you always start a Bootstrap-driven website with container. Right? And this is very important. Without the container, this stuff is going to start to look and behave differently. So by omitting that, if I take a look at what happens here, you'll notice now it's kind of going all the way bleeding to the edge, which is not usually what we want, because we usually want these things to not have too much difference once the screen size gets to a certain point. So here, it's always 100% width. But by having the container, right, what we can do is make sure that the content is in the center. And then once we get to a certain size, right, it actually has a predictable behavior of adding padding, but still being readable. So here the padding's this much, but as we shrink it, there's a breakpoint at which now this is the width of the columns and the padding. And there's a little variability in the padding, but the content isn't changing until I reach another breakpoint. And so these breakpoints are sort of predefined pixel values in the rules that kind of say, well, like mobile phones have a breakpoint of this size, iPads have a breakpoint of this size. This is the optimal way that we can size these things. And so container have rows, rows have columns. And again, you want to be very careful about where you put these things. For example, if I have a column that's outside of my row, so you'll notice here, right, I have a column and it is not nested inside a row. Let's take a look at this one and see where it is. And here's the verdict. You can see that, again, it's behaving a little bit differently because it's outside of a row, doesn't know what to do. And so now you don't get this nice alignment with this stuff. This one has a left alignment here. This one's a little dented in and it looks a little sloppy. We can fix this by following the convention that Bootstrap expects. Have a row, and inside the row, move the column. And now we can see that it aligns perfectly with the rest of the content. And so this is very important. It's a common mistake that users make. They get sloppy and they don't follow this convention. Containers have rows, rows have columns. Columns can have further rows, and those rows can have further columns. And that's the pattern you absolutely must follow when you're using Bootstrap. As you get more advanced in Bootstrap, then there are some more interesting things that you can be thinking about to adjust how these things work. But for the most part, any kind of code that you are going to be building, right, you really should be, you really should be placing it inside your column divs. So, this is the actual content that I want. Stick it inside a column. Right? This is the content that I want, right? Maybe it has even something like an image in it here. Image, right? Source equals, right? Something, place HTTP, place, hold it /50x50, right? So now this one has an image in there. But again, all of this stuff, when you actually kind of break it down and take a look, it is nested inside a column. Even if it's going to take up the entire whole row, and then make one column that takes up the entire row and stick your content inside the column. Again, once you deviate from this rule, I cannot predict what's going to happen. It makes debugging really hard too. So that's sort of the oath of that you take when you use systems like this. So that's the grid system. And, there are other kinds of techniques that you can use, but I think for us, the most important part is just understanding how to split things up. You can change how wide these columns are by adding numbers up to 12. You think about it in terms of proportions of 12. And yeah, that should get you up and running in terms of getting these layouts set up. And the grid system is something that's used across multiple frameworks. So each one, the classes they use will be different, but the concept of how we split things up into rows, columns, and use numbers to divide how wide those things are usually pretty much the same. So like we just saw, Bootstrap expects a certain structure when we're using the grid system. And different parts of that structure, the parent and children divs, have to have certain classes that Bootstrap provided for us in order for the grid system to work. Again, what I'm trying to say is we need to be very mindful of the HTML structure that Bootstrap expects and the specific classes that they provide to make things work the way that we want. So what I want to do is take that grid system, look at it again of what you need to be paying attention to, and then use that same principle of HTML structure and awareness of class-driven CSS-ness to get some components up and running with our little demonstration application. So looking at this simplified web page, which is just a container row and 2 columns, again, when we're taking a look at how do we learn Bootstrap and do this, you want to pay attention to, again, the structure. So what's the parent? What's the child? What are the subchildren of that thing? Because there's an order. We already established that by having the column outside of the row, we have violated the structure that Bootstrap expects, which is container row column. Here, the column is a child of the container, and funny things happen when we do that. And so again, this is something you keep in mind when you're looking through the documentation. Here in Bootstrap and many documentation things, there are a lot of different kinds of examples that they give you. For example, here, this is how you create a basic grid. But if we go down and take a look at something like these auto grids, here's the example, and they'll show you the structure they want, the class names that they want. And by paying attention to those two things, right, you will be able to use these examples and understand how to not just copy paste them, but what they mean when you copy paste them into your code. And it gets more complex. For example, you might notice that I went over and talked a little bit about things like the numbers. Well, in the documentation, here's how you set up the column width. And here we have 1, 2, and what is it like? Oh, this is 1 unit, this is wider, like 6 units, and this is 1 unit. And so by looking at this example, you're going to have to kind of start to understand, oh, like I see the relationship between what I see here, their example, and the code structure and the classes they used. And so I can make things a little bit wider by using a class called call-6. And, you're going to also have to make inferences about this. Well, let's take a look at the next example, right? I ran into call-6, but this is the first time I ran into call-5. But you can kind of start to infer that this must be a number that represents how wide. So that's the pattern that I need to remember. If I wanted to make a column that's only 2 units wide, I could just replace this with the number 2. And so, getting good with code is a lot about starting to understand, what those key pattern features are, so you can kind of then expand and generalize the ideas to other aspects. So here you can see that there's a lot of different stuff we can do with grids, variable with content, right? And then there's a lot of stuff like column MD auto, column LG2. What is LG? What is MD? Well, those are the kinds of questions that you would have to ask yourself and then look up inside of the references. So again, these are things here that you don't necessarily have to memorize, right? I don't expect you to memorize all of these things. I certainly don't. But, if you understand and go through the docs just to understand things like, oh, I can mix and match things. There are things called gutters. There are also things like row columns, whatever those are. There are things called, let's see, what else is there? Like, let's look up something like nested, right? Nesting, right? So if I want to nest stuff, here's how you could do it. The rule is container row and then column, and inside that, further rows. And, this is how we learn, right? We can't memorize everything, so we need to be able to go to the docs and look for these things through the examples and implement. So again, focusing on structure and the class-based drivenness of it, let's actually look at another part of Bootstrap called components. So, one of the other problems that Bootstrap solves is this idea that there are lots of different kinds of common interfaces that we use. For example, these are alerts, right? You've probably seen little messages like this on your web page when you visit some kind of website. And, those are common. So there's a way that you can produce alerts. This is the structural pattern, right? A div with two classes, one for the basics, alert, and then one to kind of dictate things like the color of the alert. Primary is blue and secondary is going to be green. So, by mixing and matching these things, alert and alert danger, I can get a red alert to pop up. And this is something that once you understand, here's the structure and here are the classes, now you can copy paste this into your code and see what happens. So I'm going to copy paste this into my second column by just coming in here. Since now it's getting complex, I'm going to start nesting this stuff a little bit with nice formatting. And you'll notice that here I now have an alert that takes up the second column, and it's looking pretty good. If I use the generalizability of the pattern, I change this success to one of those other keywords like primary, you'll notice that my alert now turns blue, and that was pretty painless and easy. When you look at this, you'll notice I copy pasted, and there's actually another attribute called role equal alert. And one of the things I want you to kind of understand is, different attributes have different ways that the program is using it. To be honest, I don't know if Bootstrap uses this attribute in a very special way. But in general, when you're first starting to learn, the only attribute that is important is the class. And so, by removing role, nothing really seems to change. And this is kind of important because as the components we look at get more and more complex, it can get more and more confusing. For example, let's take a look at another component called a card. You might have seen something like a card on Pinterest, right? Every kind of card is placed on the grid somewhere, and they usually have an image and some text underneath. And when we take a look at the structure of this HTML, it's a little bit more complex, and there's a whole bunch of other kinds of things going on with this, right? We got hrefs, and we've got source, and we've got this. But again, with Bootstrap, it's class-driven. And so the classes are what provide a lot of, or if not all of, the visual aspects of how it's represented. And so the thing when you're studying these examples to look at is the structure. So image must be inside a parent div called class card. Inside the div with the class card, I have to have a div with the class card body. So again, you can imagine, right? This thing probably determines how this portion of this demonstration works. If the card body is outside of the parent card, it's not going to work because a lot of these rules are dependent on the hierarchical nature of where it's found. So that's what I want you to kind of be aware of. And let's copy paste this code into our Bootstrap. Let's put it in column A so we can kind of see side by side how these two different components work. And again, I'm just going to come over here and do format HTML so it looks nice. And what you'll notice is when I do this, it's looking a little bit wonky. It's violating the rule here. Images showing up. And the reason is, we just copy pasted all of that code, including this other attribute, which isn't necessarily part of the card. They are inline adding an attribute called style and fixing the width at 18 rem. So because now this has a fixed width, it's violating the auto width of the columns. Let's get rid of that. Once I get rid of that and reduce this down back to the essence of what is the Bootstrap stuff, now you'll notice that the card takes up the full width of the column really nicely. And if I replace this source with some kind of an image, for example, again, let's just go into my assets. So if you have CodePen Pro, you can go into assets, and I'm just going to use another one of these cute images that I have, copy the URL, come back over here, and I'm going to come and paste that here and save this. So now, right, you'll notice that my image is inside of the card, and it auto kind of figures out how big my card width is, and it'll squeeze the image inside there, and this is looking nice and dandy, right? So, this is a component for a card, and when we look at this code, again, the places to kind of focus on are what are the classes. So in order to produce this card, right, I have a card parent class. Inside of there, I'm going to immediately have an image as a child, right? And this child has a class called card image top. What happens if I remove this card image top? Then, for example, over here, you can see how it distorts the image given the constraints of the size of the parent. This is how the default image would work. But by having this card image top, it will automatically figure out the sizing rules. And let's save this and refresh this if I need to, because it's not refreshing itself. So refresh. And so now it's acting the way that you would expect it to act. And so that's really important. Alt, again, this has nothing to do with Bootstrap, but it's often friendly to have an alt attribute on images so that people who are using screen readers can kind of understand what the image is even without seeing it. But more importantly, back to Bootstrap, again, the first child is the image. The second child of this card is this div with the class card body. What happens if I remove this card body from this div? You can look over here. Now the margins, right, between this content and the edge of the card is all messed up and not looking nice. So that's what this thing does. And when you're learning these things, I think that by adding and removing the classes a little bit, right, it's a great way to kind of start to see what each of these classes do in the larger component. You don't have to have it memorized, but just by playing around with it, tinkering with it a little bit, you can start to get a sense of what some of these things are. And what you'll notice is that, this convention like dash body is something that's used often in other components as well. It might be something like, instead of card, I don't know, media dash body or whatever. Conventions are common things that, again, add to our Rolodex of patterns. And once you understand those, you can kind of guess what the classes might be without looking at the documentations. But regardless, right, inside card body, now we have a heading, but it has this class, so that's important. After that, we have a paragraph, but it has something called card-text. That's important. And then finally, right, we have something here, which is sort of like button. Now, again, these cards, these components can be mixed and matched. And so without this anchor with the BTN class, which is a button class, our card still looks good. And some cards are basically just that, right? Image and text. But some cards have actions. And so this is a component that actually has an example component that actually has an even smaller component inside, which is buttons. If we go into our documentation and take a look at something like buttons, you'll notice that in order to create a button, all we have to do is copy paste this and add the class BTN and BTN whatever. Primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark, link, or white, nothing. So you might have already noticed, hey, this is actually very similar to what I was going through with alerts. If we look at alerts, alert dash primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, and the color scheme is kind of similar. This is what I mean by convention. Again, it's like this is something that the people who created Bootstrap made up for themselves. But they use this idea of primary, secondary success in many places across their component UI. And so you already got to get a sense of if I want something that's blue, it's going to be primary. If I want something that's, yay, you did it, success, then that's going to end up looking green. And so, again, this is the way to look at it. By looking at a class and looking for these patterns, you can kind of guess, oh, if I want to change the color of this brand new component, maybe I can add a dash primary and it does things. So again, kind of coming back, copy paste this. And, if I have this inside of this thing, the card, then for whatever reason, my browser is not updating itself every time. So I'm going to have to refresh this often. Now I have a button. And you'll notice, again, it takes two classes this time. So if I only have BTN primary, then, for example, my button looks really bad. It has the background color, but it doesn't have the padding to make it nice and button looking. By adding the BTN, that provides the kind of outline layout of the button itself. And go ahead and refresh this for me, please. There's something about auto refresh today. Here we are. In conjunction with this other one is what produces the thing. And this is basically a component in and of itself that we can then include into other components like a card. So that's kind of it. We'll take a look at one more, a little bit more complex. Let's take a look at something like a carousel. So a carousel, right, is essentially a slideshow. So, for a carousel, there's lots of different things that we can do. But for example, by clicking on these things, it goes from first slide to second slide to third slide. And again, you can notice that the complexity of this component gets bigger. There are a lot of things: attribute ID, data dash ride, class, source, things of that nature. But again, the thing that's most important for us right now is to focus on the idea of the hierarchy and the classes. So the most outer element is going to have this carousel class and something called slide. Then inside, I have something called carousel inner. And then inside that, however many items, each one's going to have carousel item, carousel item, carousel item. And then I'm going to start with the first one being active, and that's going to do something. And so again, by copy pasting this into Bootstrap, and I could probably create, since I have a row and a carousel is pretty big, create another row, make another column, and my content, the carousel, goes inside. And if I format the HTML really nice, come back down, then I should be able to see something. And right now it's looking a little bit wonky, maybe because I don't have any image sources, so it doesn't know where to look. Let's just copy paste this same thing to just test and see whether this works or not. So I'm going to come over here and replace the sources with the URL and save. And let's see what happens. So here it is. And here's my cute little thing. And if I click on it, there it is. It's carouseling through my images of my cats. And so, you can see how this works. And again, you can start to kind of get an understanding of how these things work by starting to remove certain things. Like what happens if I remove this ID? And in some ways, I believe that this may or may not actually have an effect. Normally, it's the classes that do a lot of the work, and the IDs, right? I can replace this with whatever I want. One way I can test whether this is important is I just copy and then find this and look for that very name. And I can see that the ID actually has a href here, right? Carousel example controls and carousel example controls. So, this is actually maybe quite important in order for it to understand, hey, this basically an anchor that's like an arrow. I don't know if this is visible, but if I highlight this, you can see that they're actually arrows. My image is bad because it's white, but this is the anchor. And if I click on this, that's what makes it go back or forwards. But this seems to have a reference to this original parent class carousel element. And so when you see things like that, then that means maybe the ID is also important, and you're going to have to make that decision, right, of which parts of these are important, which parts aren't. And, you can test it by kind of, for example, removing these things and seeing what happens. If I remove this and save this and I refresh this page, right now, for example, when I come back over here, clicking on it seems to break. And so that ID was definitely kind of important. I'm going to Control Z, and of course I can't Control Z it for whatever reason. Copy this. ID must be on the parent carousel element. So copy that back here. And now when I come back, right, and click, it is working once again. So this is really cool. And, play around with different kinds of things. Which classes are important to get things to work? Which classes aren't? And there are also special classes called data dash something, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Essentially, with things like this is a dynamic component that has, inputs and actions. So when I click on something, my click event triggers this to slide left or right. That takes JavaScript, and that's why we imported the JavaScript Bootstrap at the beginning. And for many of these, right, in order for that JavaScript to work, we're not writing any JavaScript. We're relying on Bootstrap. But the way we tell Bootstrap that the JavaScript should be hooked up to this component is through these data dash attributes. And you'll notice that here it says data dash ride, whatever that means. This is all made up. But carousel, right? This is saying, hey, the carousel logic should be applied here. And so that's something to think about as well. So again, kind of coming back, we're looked at a couple of different components. There are many. And so it makes a lot of sense to look at the different components available to you. For example, if you want to make a drop down, these are the examples of how you would do it. And there's a lot of documentation that explains exactly what you need to do in order to implement it. We have things like forms, right? To make forms look nice like this. You're going to have a certain kind of structure. like a form element, and then inside have a div with a form group, then a label, and then add the class form control to make the input look a little bit nicer than a default one. You can do complex things like creating input groups with little labels and stuff at the beginning. You can do things like create a jumbotron, which is kind of overused, but it's like a giant header, like on the front page. You can do things like, for example, create modals, which are kind of fun ways that you can make a pop-up. Like by clicking this image, it grays out the screen and creates what's called a modal or dialogue that you can have extra information on. And again, this is JavaScripty because I'm clicking on it and this opens, and when I push this, it closes. But again, you notice here, if we look at this, they have things like data dash toggle modal. This data dash attribute is what tells Bootstrap, hey, implement the modal JavaScript logic to this button. Things like data target, this looks like an ID if we use selector rules, right, is pointing to this button should point to the target ID example modal. And here's the structure for our modal. This has the ID example. And when we click on this, what we see here is actually this code here. And so to produce that, we would again be following mostly the class-driven hierarchy of it. And then the other things we can test out to see if it's super important or not. But again, classes drive Bootstrap. Other attributes like ID can be important. Data dash is important when you're trying to attribute JavaScript logic to these things. And then the rest of them, right, don't get confused by. You can usually omit or remove things to make the code a little bit cleaner for you to analyze. And I think in the beginning, that's one of the most important things. So now that we have a basic understanding of what we should be looking for, the HTML structure in the documentation, as well as the classes Bootstrap uses to drive how these things look, let's take a look at some of the more interesting aspects of JavaScript with Bootstrap and what's actually happening to the DOM when we play with Bootstrap and JavaScript. So let's open up another example using the modal and check out how that makes changes to the DOM. So here's a modal. Essentially, I have a button, and when I click on it, a little dialog comes up. And this dialog has like a title and some content, and it has some actions at the bottom. I can dismiss the modal by clicking on this X, or maybe, for example, clicking on the close button. Or I could have some JavaScript hooked up to save changes that does some stuff. But essentially, the idea of a modal is a component that gives you a dialog message that kind of pops up and brings attention to itself by graying everything else in the background out. So let's implement this and see what's actually happening on the DOM in terms of making these behaviors happen. So I'm back inside of here. This is the documentation, and I'm just going to copy paste this stuff and paying attention to, okay, button to kind of get things going. So that's one part. So I'm adding the class button primary. That's what gives it the color. And this data dash toggle and data dash target, right? Data dash attributes have something to do with Bootstrap JavaScript behavior. So these are also probably important. And it makes sense, right? This button is associated with, it should behave like a modal stuff. So I'm going to say data, this button toggles a modal, and the target of the modal that it toggles is something called ID example modal. So down here, I have this div class, modal fade. So these are the classes important in terms of making a whole modal, but I also have the ID example modal, which is referenced from here, the target that will make this thing pop up. There's a couple extra things. I'm not really sure what they are, but I can kind of test it out and look at it. And again, inside of the modal, I have a modal dialog. Inside the dialog, I have content. Inside the content, I have a header, which has modal title. But again, inside of content, a sibling to the header, I have the body, which is where some text can go, and also another sibling is modal footer. So getting that general structure kind of in mind is the starting point where I go. So I'm going to do this, copy paste this into here, and I'm just going to kind of copy paste it into my column. I'm going to kind of format this. Nice. So here it is. And you'll notice that, for example, here, I'm going to remove that. And there's my launch modal dialog button. And when I click on this, bang, there's my modal. And essentially when I push close, it closes. And so this is looking pretty good. And I could probably add this to other places if I want. For this demonstration, I'm not going to actually go into it, but we already covered that these things are important, something to look at and read about with careful eye in the docs. But what I'm really interested in is what is this doing to the DOM? Like this action of when I click on it and suddenly this is grayed out and this thing pops up. What's actually happening here? And the way that we can kind of view this is by going into, you guessed it, debug mode. So I'm going to go into debug mode, which opens up this page. And now this page looks super tiny. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Launch demo modal. And again, it behaves exactly what we want. And we close this. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click and go into inspect. And we're going to take a look at some of this code. So if I make this a little bit bigger, right, and I open this up, for example, let's just open this and then right click on this and inspect it. That jumps right into the modal code. And here it is, right? And so what's happening here is you'll notice that it looks very similar to what we had in our code over here. For example, here, in order to make the modal, I have something called class modal and then fade. But over here, there is a little bit of a different thing here. It says div class modal fade show. Show. When I come back over here, I certainly don't see show, but when I come over here, I do. Well, let's see what happens when I close this. So when I close it, you'll notice that there was a bunch of flashes on the right-hand side. And when I close it, you'll notice that here, div class equals modal space fade. Now the show class has been removed. Let's do that one more time. I'm going to click on this, and suddenly, oh, wait a second, it added show and also added some extra things like style. Let's close this again. And now style equal display none, and things like aria hidden equal true. Can toggle this back on, right? Style equal display block, role equal dialog. So what does this mean? What this means is, the way the JavaScript is set up is when I click this button, go into the DOM, grab this modal. Remember, the target is pointing to this ID, and change the class by adding the class called show. And when I add the class called show, then this thing pops up with animation. To demonstrate that without clicking on the button, if I just kind of come in here and add that class show, enter and manipulate it, I thought certain things would happen. So that's one thing that happens. But again, another thing that happens is this style display none gets turned into block, I think. And now you can see how there is a modal here. And if I click on the close button, it removes the show and changes display back to something else. I think clicking on this now won't work because I have broken it. But if I kind of come back and remove this manually, and then you notice that went away, and then this becomes something else. I forgot what it was actually, hidden, I think. And now it's back to the original state. So what I'm trying to say here is, there's code that Bootstrap runs that manipulates the DOM by adding a class, changing the style properties, right? The class name property, the style properties, other kinds of attributes and properties of the element that makes it happen. And when I push the close button, it's again going through, finding this element, removing the class names, changing the style properties of it. And that's what gets this to work. And in theory, right, even though in this example it didn't really work too well, in theory, that's kind of just automated stuff that we've been doing already, right? If I wanted to add, for example, the show class to this, I could, for example, take this and I'm going to do, let's say, store as a global variable. So I'm just going to store a reference to this element. So by store global variable, and so now it's called temp1. So anytime that I say temp1, it's actually pointing to the div with the ID example modal, with the class modal and fade. And if I do something like, for example, class name is set it to modal fade show, right? Now this part just added that here. And another logical piece that happens is something like temp1 dot, I think it's something like style, and we can set dot display, right, equal to a new value. And again, instead of hidden, I'm going to say block, and there's our modal, right? So again, it's not complete. There's some extra things that JavaScript is doing too, but essentially JavaScript is just doing this: change the class name, change the style display, change some other things like the background. And when I push close, it does the opposite. So the opposite would be come over here, right, and remove the show. So set the class name to just modal fade, right? And there it disappears. Change the display style from block to hidden. And it does this, and that's what gets us back to this state. So it's just a matter of kind of thinking when I have my original thing in the DOM, it has properties like class name and style that have a state. And by using Bootstrap JavaScript logic, we can change the state so that it shows or disappears. And that's really all these things are. Just the DOM is being manipulated dynamically all the time. Let's look at one other example just to kind of show this thing in action. So, for example, I'm going to kind of come back over here and remove all of this stuff. Have a closing div here before I forget. And let's look at carousel once more. So with carousel, I kind of come in, take a look at this, and these are the slides only with controls, some things with indicators, right, and stuff like that. What I want to do is actually I want to have something with a time interval. Right? So actually, a nice way to do this is let's just come over here, copy paste this simple carousel code, which we already talked about, come back into my code pen, which is here, paste that, format it so it looks nice, and let's just create some images here, like have some other assets so that we can see the images really clearly. So I'm just going to use this fishing one. So I'm going to go copy as and copy the URL, come back over here, and I can just kind of do this. Let's just replace this with this. And let's just have another asset so it's very easy to see that we are actually switching through different images. So we'll use this one. And come back over. I'm going to remove this and one more image assets. And let's just do something like, yeah, Krampus. Let's use Krampus. So copy URL. Yeah, you look at my assets and you're probably wondering like, what exactly is he building? So here we go. Let's save this. And so here we are. And this thing, I think the simplest one actually doesn't have controls. So, now I have to add the controls. That was really dumb of me. But with controls, let's see, we have to remember that we have this data ride carousel. We also have to add these guys. So again, kind of understand the difference. This is the basic of a carousel, right? But what I'm missing here is essentially this thing, these two control classes, which are these guys. And the thing, remember, is this has an href that references the ID, so I better add this ID as well. So those are the things I keep in mind. I copy these two things, come back over here. Again, I'm thinking, wait a second, what was the structure of the HTML again? Was it inside of carousel inner? Was it outside of carousel inner? So I go back over here and check. So this A is outside of carousel inner because carousel inner starts here and it ends here. So this is a sibling to the carousel inner. So I just saved myself some mistake time. Otherwise, I might have copy pasted in the wrong place. Like this is inside carousel inner. So I want it to be a sibling here. And again, it might even help to have things like formats. So, like if I just add a little space between the most important parts, makes it kind of easy also to see the chunking of which parts are children or parents or whatever. So now you can see that they have these images thing and they're not working because what did I forget? Oh yeah, the pattern. If I have these things here, the href needs to point to an ID. So I got to copy paste that, come back over here, and ID is applied to, wait, I forget. It is applied to the parent div with the class carousel. So I come back over here. This is the class carousel. Here's the ID. And it actually does have that. So the question is, what is going on and why isn't this working? And it's not working because now I have to figure this out. Why isn't it working? So let's look at my code a little bit wider so I can kind of see. Have carousel example slides only. Here, carousel. Oh, the ID is different because I copy pasted the wrong thing. Here, the ID is carousel example slides only. This is carousel example controls. I can actually change all of these to some other ID of my choosing. Again, that's just IDs are, they're not fixed. So you can come up with your own. My carousel is fine. So now I save this and let's take a look at how this works. And now it's working pretty good. The sizing is a little bit of an issue, but again, we can see how this is working just fine. So before I kind of show what's happening here, right, one of the things I want to show is this thing and how the DOM will change. So I want this to automatically slide every couple seconds. And I think if I don't touch anything, it will automatically slide for me. Maybe? No? Doesn't? Yes? Yeah, so after a couple seconds it does. But for example, I want it to slide more frequently. Well, again, it's like we can do a lot of things with JavaScript, but the nice thing about these frameworks is we don't have to actually touch the JavaScript. We just need to have a way to interface with it. And we already established that these data dash attributes help us to implement JavaScript logic on these components without any JavaScript coding at all. And a lot of times these things will have options. Like for example, with a carousel, one of the options might be, do you want it to loop? One of the options might be, do you want it to shift every couple seconds? So I'm going to look up something called options, right? And you'll notice that here, options can be passed via the data attributes or JavaScript. So this is a very JavaScript way that we can manually do things, but we're just going to do it through HTML. If we say something like here, right, for data attributes, append the option name to data, as in data dash interval equals some value, then Bootstrap knows, oh, here's a data attribute. I should automatically implement the JavaScript for this author. And so this is really cool, right? If I say, oh, the default is 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds, and I want to make this cycle every second, I can say data dash interval 1000 equals, quote, 1000, and it'll change the delay between cycling times. And if I want this to be controllable by my keyboard, I could say, data dash keyboard true, or data dash, for example, pause. And wait, but what's pause? I got to read the docs. So if set to hover, which is the default, pausing the cycling of the carousel, mouse enter, and resuming the cycle when mouse leaves. So that means when my mouse is over the carousel, it's not going to cycle automatically. It's kind of annoying if you want to look at an image, but it cycles before you get the chance. So pausing is in JavaScript-driven interaction that you can implement just by having data dash pause. And of course, there's these other things too. Like you notice maybe ride. In our code, we actually had something like, I think, data dash ride carousel or whatever. And over here, what is that, right? Auto plays the carousel after the user manually cycles the first item. So if the value is carousel, it auto plays the carousel on load. So if we removed, right, this value carousel from the dash ride data attribute, then it won't automatically start cycling through. So to kind of go through that, right, a lot of these components have these data dash options, which is a great way to implement JavaScript before we know anything about JavaScript. But let's do this. So data dash interval, and let's change the interval to something like, so I'm going to add another dash, data dash interval, and it wanted a number between something and, the default's 5,000. So I'm just going to say 1,000. Save this, and let's see the behavior of the carousel. So now 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000. You can see it's cycling through. And what I want to do now is let's go in and see what's happening to the DOM to make this occur. So change view. Well, actually, I already have it, but change view, debug mode, and here it is, and it's working in its full glory, pretty big. Go into inspect. And so now if I kind of come over and open this up and take a look at my carousel, it's nested pretty deeply in there, and look inside my inner carousel, you'll notice that every second JavaScript is actually changing the names of the classes to these items inside the carousel inner once every second. And so you can start to see how the logic of this works. If we set up the carousel with the data ride carousel, and we apply the JavaScript to it, like of 1,000, every 1 second, something in JavaScript comes around and shifts what the names of the classes are, and that's what gives it the illusion of these the motion. And I think if I click outside it again, it unpauses itself, but once my cursor is in it, now it's paused. So let's take a look at this a little bit. As my mouse is inside this, it is paused. When we look at the right-hand side, you'll notice that the second image carousel item has a class called active. I'm going to remove my mouse from this for 1 second and put it back, and let's see how the DOM is manipulated, focusing on the class names. What is the JavaScript logic doing? So I move it out, 1 second passes, it shifts, I move my mouse back in. You'll notice now on the code side, the DOM has removed the active class from the second image and applied the active class on the third image. And if I do this again, the JavaScript logic is going to run 1 second, remove the active class, add the active class. And so now it removed the active class from the third image and applied it to the first carousel item, which is why this shows. So that's kind of cool. In fact, right, like, let's take a look at this a little bit more. Like if I kind of come in here and I'm going to kind of pause this because this is getting a little bit annoying. So I'm going to come back over here and say, let's remove this carousel, right, to nothing. So data ride nothing. I think if I do that, then it will not automatically play. I can come back over here and refresh this. And so now when I right click and inspect this and take a look at my carousel inner, this one is active. And so if I come into here and say store as a global variable temp1, right? And I can store the second element as temp2, right? Global variable temp1, temp2. This one's the active one, this one's not. I can say something like temp1, and let's do something like class list that remove the class called active. And if I do that, right, it kind of disappears. And if I do temp1 dot class list and then add, and then I say active, right? So this is just another way of manipulating the DOM, right? Oh, I did the wrong one, right? I removed it from temp1, re-added it to temp1. Let's do that again, right? So I'm going to say first remove active from temp1, then add it to temp2, and now this one shows. If I kind of go ahead and do this with, for example, temp2, and I remove active, right? And then if I store this one as global variable temp3, and I say add the active class to temp3, right? Not remove, right? Add. Now the third image shows. And so you can already kind of see how, even though this is done manually, we are manipulating the DOM and doing these things. Well, essentially, that's all Bootstrap is doing too. And as you get more and more used to how manually you could be thinking about each procedural step in this giant behavior of an image carousel, you can break it down. And then, with the power of JavaScript, you can make your own custom behaviors just by, first do this, then add this, then remove that, then change this. And all of that has to do with being able to select things like in our HTML, right? And then manipulate the DOM through the property values pairs. That's all Bootstrap is doing, but a lot of these rules are just implemented for you in a way that you just have to say what attributes and options you're going to add, and then the magic happens. But it gets more interesting once we can do this at a custom level, because again, there's so many limitations to what this can do with the carousel. And there might be a feature that you want to add to this or your own carousel that does something kind of different that this doesn't. For example, I don't know, maybe you want the images to spin into the view, or maybe you want the images to flip into the view, or from the depth come forward from whatever. In that kind of case, you might have to create your own JavaScript functions and CSS classes. So that's where understanding at the native foundational level what's going on is really going to help. So that's pretty exciting. Again, this is where we're going to be heading, but each time I just want you to get a sense of all these things we're doing, where is it going towards? And again, without knowing any JavaScript, we still do already understand certain logical concepts of what's happening underneath the hood. Bootstrap isn't mandatory by any means. Many web pages use either alternative frameworks or even no frameworks at all in order to fine-tune and custom make the user experience. That said, building from scratch always takes time. And for us, it's more important to be able to build things quickly that are user-friendly enough so we can get to the fun stuff of learning how to computationally manipulate it in different ways. I want you all to explore Bootstrap components on an as-you-need basis. Once you get the idea of how to implement one component, you'll quickly learn the process of how you can implement others. It does take careful reading of the documents and meticulous analysis of the examples. Please don't try to memorize everything. Using references and copy-pasting things are common practice, but without the effort of trying to understand the essence of some of these things, the structure and major classes, It's easy to copy paste the wrong thing, and that takes up even more time debugging. So, this is a tool that uses many of the foundations of HTML and CSS that we've covered so far. There are many other convenient features, like utility classes of Bootstrap, that can come in handy later. I want you to browse through the different features to be aware of what's available to you, so that when you do run into problems in the future you need to solve, you have a sense that, maybe Bootstrap can make my life better.